Shalom. I am Dr. Jeffrey Schein, the Executive Director of the Mordecai Kaplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood. I am coming to you as a prelude to the tape I know you're interested to be viewing on Judaism and Democracy, a dialogue between Sarah Hurwitz, Schwarz, and Elliot Dorff. My message is the proverbial good news and bad news. The bad news is that the recording of the webinar only picked up about 20 minutes into the webinar. The good news is that the heart of the webinar, the most vigorous exchange of ideas, the core of the presentation of the presenters, is on the recording. You will come in at the 20-minute mark. You will have missed a number of introductions, procedures for a given webinar, the biographies of our presenters, and you will be 5 minutes into Rabbi Sid Schwarz's presentation on Judaism and democracy through the lens of his work in Jewish civics, his understanding of the challenges of democracy. Rabbi Schwarz began by exploring Mordecai Kaplan's commitment to democracy, his sense of how democracy and Judaism needed to work hand in hand. He has quoted from a little known but important Kaplan volume that he co-authored with several non-Jewish co-authors called The Faith of America. And in that volume, Kaplan had helped develop liturgies, prayers for the holidays, the American holidays, with some notes of how it related back to Jewish tradition. So that's where you will jump in. And again, the core of Sid's presentations, the following presentation by Elliot Dorff, and the facilitation of a dialogue by Sarah Hurwitz, as well as questions coming from the 70 or so people who were gathered together for the webinar, that will all be there for you. So I hope you enjoy. I hope you will forgive us this technical lapse and continue to return to our many webinars, the next of which is on December 11th. So thanks for your forbearance, and go enjoy the dialogue.
Adjusting to modernity is about how do we make sure that Jews stay Jewish and not get assimilated into the host culture. For Kaplan, the host culture was a benefit, was a value added. And he felt that both Jews and Judaism could learn from American principles and values. And he felt that Judaism could actually inform the conduct of American democracy. And he felt that was a healthy, mutually reinforcing two-way street. He also puts out the idea about collective consciousness, which he argues lies at the heart of every nation, people, or civilization. And he believed that every nation or people needs to cultivate this sense of a collective consciousness through an intentional program of education, ritual and sancta, holidays, songs, historical memory, and stories. Now, clearly, for a minority group, you don't have an identity unless you have that menu of offerings to cultivate that consciousness and to maintain an identity in the midst of a host culture. But Kaplan went a step further and said, even the host culture needs that. And in one of his less known books, but I would argue his most unique book, he wrote a book called The Faith of America in 1951, where he actually does for Americanism what he did for Judaism with his more than a dozen books about how to create that collective consciousness for Jews. And in that book of The Faith of America, he essentially takes each American holiday, and many people have observed that somewhat sarcastically, but not incorrectly, that for many Americans, the only way you know it's a holiday is when a sale goes on at the department stores, right? Which is a pretty shallow way to note important moments in the American calendar. But Kaplan takes his holidays much more seriously. So for an obvious one, Thanksgiving is to cultivate the value of gratitude, okay? But maybe less obvious, he takes Memorial Day and says, here's a day when we need to honor the sacrifice necessary to preserve American ideals in the face of adversity. And he does that with every holiday in his attempt to say American democracy and the beauty of what America brings to the table cannot be preserved unless there's an intentional program of cultivating this collective consciousness. And the fact that he wrote this in 1951, it's almost like presaging the moment we live in now, because, and I'll come back to this point in a few minutes, the fact that our democracy and our American ideals are so much at risk tells us that we, America, I'm not saying we as Jews here, we as America have not sufficiently heeded Dr. Kaplan's call to say, unless we intentionally cultivate the values, they will not be with us forever. I want to take a few minutes to talk about how Jews thought about their place in America and their contribution to American democracy, because it has evolved quite a bit. And I would say that in my own life and career, I've been a little bit part of that story. I think it might be important to kind of observe. So for a good century and a half, if I would date from 1840 to 1990, so 1840 becomes the set point of the German Jewish immigration to America. Of course, Eastern European Jews come starting in the 1880s, okay? But I would argue till almost the end of the 20th century, the primary engagement of the Jewish community with democracy was some combination of what's called defense work and community relations. By defense work, I mean, how do we protect the Jews who come to this country from anti-Semitism, persecution, and exclusion? That was the main agenda of most of the agencies that were created to bring the Jewish community into American public affairs. Examples, the American Jewish Committee is the granddaddy of all, founded in 1906, which was a response to the pogroms against Jews in Russia. And the committee felt that American Jews were in a position to essentially lobby the American government to intercede on behalf of the Jews in Europe, in Russia. The ADL was created in 1913 in response to the conviction of a Jew named Leo Frank in Atlanta. He was convicted on trumped up charges, and when the conviction was thrown out, he was actually lynched 2 years later, taken out of a jail cell and hung by a crowd. The American Jewish Congress was created in 1918, primarily giving a voice to Eastern Europeans who had come to the country about 15, 20 years earlier, feeling that the German Jewish organizations like Committee and ADL didn't sufficiently speak for AJ Congress. Now, fast forward to the post-World War II era, the Jewish public agenda was essentially threefold, and then it got a bit more complicated. Number one, fighting anti-Semitism at home and abroad. Number two, commemorating the Holocaust. And number three, support for the state of Israel. By the 1960s, the support and the effort to save Soviet Jewry became a fourth and large piece of the agenda as well. On the second tier of issues were issues like church-state separation, intergroup relations, labor rights, and civil rights, also important to the agenda of the Jewish public agenda, but I would say on a second tier. Now, I entered the field in 1984 when I moved to Washington to become the executive director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington, D.C. Some of you may know that every major city in the country, over 100, have these JCRCs, which essentially oversee the public agenda of the Jewish community, both domestically and internationally. And I came in and I inherited that agenda of fighting anti-Semitism, Israel, remembering the Shoah, and then Soviet Jewry. And because I came as a rabbi, I felt that the conversations on issues had to be informed by Jewish texts and values. I recall during my tenure, there was a bill in Congress to pay a settlement, reparations, so to speak, to Japanese Americans who were unjustly interred during World War II out of fear that they would form a fifth column in America in the midst of World War II. And in the conversation, I felt that there were many, many teachings from Judaism that could inform the conversation. But I learned the hard way from people who were veterans in the field. I was kind of a young buck at the time, that that's not the way we do things here. That Judaism was here, and if you were interested in Jewish education, you did the Jewish thing in Jewish schools and synagogues. And we, the community relation field, was in the field of politics and policy and the like, and about balancing group self-interest with the greater good of America. And to me, it was kind of a shock that those two worlds were so starkly separated. And in many ways, that experience informed my decision to create in 1988 an organization that I led for 21 years called Panim, the Institute for Jewish Leadership and Values, which precisely was about integrating Jewish learning, Jewish values, and social responsibility. And in fact, I'm not sure how conscious this was, although I do remember an email exchange I had with Jane Susswein around this, probably 20 years ago, that in many ways was informed by Kaplan's premise that if you don't create a collective consciousness around a people's engagement with its society, it will not long exist. So over the course of over 20 years, we touched the lives of over 20,000, mostly young people, high school, college, post-college, and then teacher training programs. Our first curriculum of 3 was called Jewish Civics, a Tikkun Olam World Repair Manual, and in it, there was actually a matrix that we developed of 36 core Jewish values that informed how we would enter into the conversation around American public policy. And we would cite values like Ahavat Ger, the protection of the stranger, Lo Tamad Adam Reacha, you should not stand idly by while the blood of your neighbor is being shed, Tzelem Elohim, the notion that every human being is made in the image of God and is to be treated accordingly, or Emet, the value of truth and truth-telling in all public endeavors. And while our earlier work was focused mainly on advocacy, getting young people to see how they could weigh into the issues that were confronting their country, their community, and the world, very soon in the mid-90s, the Clinton administration began making major investments in the field of community service. And so we rolled out a second aspect of our work, which is about Jewish community service called Jewish Service Learning. And we at Panim were among the pioneers of the field of Jewish service learning, which has now grown exponentially over the past several decades. Now, here's the irony. Although I got chastised when I was the executive director of the JCRC that I shouldn't mix Judaism and policy, fast forward 15 years, I was invited to the national conference of the JCPA, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, which is the umbrella of all the JCRCs, to keynote a conference on Torah and Tzedek. So I wasn't wrong, I just came a little bit too early, and you know what they say about early adopters, is sometimes you got to take your lumps to kind of try and pioneer a new way of thinking. And I would say, to be celebrated, is that by the 90s, then into the 21st century, we can celebrate the fact that a whole galaxy of organizations emerged in the Jewish community that were very confident about wearing their Judaism on their sleeve and engaging in policy with an explicit Judaic agenda, not just a Jewish self-interest agenda, but a Judaic agenda informed by Jewish texts and values. Examples, the American Jewish World Service that engage in work in the developing world with an explicitly Judaic agenda. Mazon, engaging in the work of fighting hunger in America with an explicitly Judaic agenda. The Jewish Coalition for Service was actually founded by a small group of us that were pioneers in the field of Jewish service learning. Now it has changed its name and it's called Repair the World. And all around the country, you have hubs of young people doing service work in communities, in urban areas, informed by Judaic values. The same can be said about Tzedek Hillel, taking that up and getting very big involved in the work in the cleanup to Hurricane Katrina, and following that, many semester break programs using Jewish values to engage with service learning. So there's been this evolution over for 150 years. It was like no mixing of milchik and fleshik, like the milchik was the Jewish values and the fleshik was public policy, but those two fields had to be integrated, and I think that's something to be celebrated today. And I would argue that that becomes a fulfillment of Kaplan's earlier vision, not just how Jews have benefited from America's freedom and democracy and our ability to live as free individuals here, but also how Judaism and the Jewish community can contribute to American democracy. So with that said, let me now just talk about some pain points, because we are at a very trying time in our democracy, and it predates the Trump administration, for sure. And I probably don't have time to give all the details, whether it's Citizens United decision in 2010, which allowed corporations to have no restrictions on money in the political system, the Shelby County decision, which essentially gutted the 1964 Voting Rights Act, from which we're suffering today significantly, or in a very large measure, the failure of Congress and the US administration to curtail or regulate social media companies, which has created an exponential growth of conspiracy theories, hate speech, and assaults on truth. All these things have essentially become literally a cancer on our democracy and our democratic republic. So the question is, what can we do about it? I don't have the time to talk about a variety of movements and organizations that have popped up in the past several years. They're doing really heroic work to rescue our democracy. Among them, I would just say a group like the group was it Sophia? Do I remember the name correctly? Sophie, thank you. Sophie's work with the Partnership for Democracy, or work like a group called Braver Angels, which tries to bring together reds and blues to have conversations to humanize the other side, as opposed to what we do about demonizing the other side. I take some comfort in the work of a thinker that some of you may have heard of called Parker Palmer. Parker Palmer, who's a Quaker and a public intellectual, wrote important books like The Courage to Teach, The Company of Strangers, and A Hidden Wholeness. But I think that the book that's most important for the topic on hand today is a book he wrote called Healing the Heart of Democracy, The Courage to Create a Politics Worthy of the Human Spirit. And he understands and writes in the book that any movement for social transformation always starts with the people who suffer most from the gap between the vision and the reality, and who then rally around a belief that change is possible. And he cites examples like the women's rights movement, the movement to end apartheid in South Africa, the democratization of former Soviet satellite states, the civil rights movement here in the US, and in fact, Soviet Jewry, which I would argue, and many have argued, is probably the most successful grassroots campaign for human rights that we've ever seen in history. Now, that doesn't come easily, and sometimes I wonder whether those of us who love democracy may not be feeling enough pain to rally in the way that Parker Palmer says we must. And I don't know how much deeper the pain's got to go for us to essentially feel the urgency of the moment. I certainly feel it, and sometimes my theme on Kol Nidre for my sermon was that sometimes we feel it too deeply and it becomes dysfunctional. But certainly the movements that Parker Palmer cites were powered by people whose lives were at risk, because unless they turned around that oppressive regime or that oppressive system, their lives essentially were going to be ruined. Palmer talks about the fact that we need to live an undivided life. That's actually the subtitle of his book called A Hidden Wholeness. How do we live an undivided life? And he says that the work is not just political work, it's also heart-centered work. That it's not enough to build an organization with a larger lobbying budget than the other side. He would say that that is short-sighted and short-spirited. He says we need to begin by seeing how do we change our hearts to think differently about the polity, the community, the society of which we are part. And I think that's work that we have a long way to go on, there. Palmer talks about how we need to create circles of trust or communities of congruence where we actually sit and look eye to eye with people, not simply those who are like us, who are our ethnic group, our religion, our ideology, or our political party, but look at every human being, B'Tselem Elokim, he doesn't use that term, but that's what he's getting at, to understand that at the heart of every person is the spirit to try and create a better and more wholesome society where every individual can live with dignity. Now, easier said than done, and it's probably appropriate that Palmer ends his book by quoting the 20th century Christian theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who was said once that nothing that is worth doing can be achieved in our lifetime. And of course, many of you on the screen probably know the Jewish counterpart to that from Pirkei Avot, chapter 2, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, v'lo ata ben chorim lihibatel mimena. That it is not upon us to finish the task, but we need to get started engaging with it real soon. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sid. So much to think about. I'm very excited to engage with both you and Elliot. And now I'll turn it over to Elliot.
Hi, Sid. Really good to see you again after all these years. Although I don't understand how those years pass by. I'm still 20. I don't understand what's going on here. How I have a grandchild who's 21, don't ask me. I'm gonna zoom out a bit to talk about the way in which America understands itself and the way in which Judaism understands itself, and what that means for us as American Jews. In America, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Of course, I'm quoting the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson cribbed that from John Locke, who had written that about 100 years earlier, but he had said life, liberty, and property. And you can imagine how many doctoral dissertations have been written about why did Jefferson change it, right? But in any case, as an American, I'm an individual with rights. Now, the classic Jewish story is Exodus Sinai. That's our central story. We leave Egypt not as individuals, we leave as a community. And when we get to Sinai, we don't get a single right. We get 613 commandments. I do a lot of interfaith work, and I say that's the beginning of Jewish guilt. But Catholics say we know nothing about guilt. They have that cornered. And so I'll leave it to them to say that, all right? But in any case, I'm a member of a community with duties, if I'm a Jew, and I'm an individual with rights, if I'm an American. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that rights and duties are completely separate from each other. And in some cases, they are actually just reciprocal. So if I have a right to, let's say, my shirt, you have a duty not to steal it. But rights and duties are not always reciprocal. And the duties I have to my children are different from the duties they have to me. And the rights that I have vis-a-vis other people are not necessarily the reciprocal mirror image, as it were, of the duties that they have to me. So, and in any case, if I get up in the morning and I'm an individual with rights, then the world owes me. But if I get up in the morning and I'm a member of a community with duties, then I owe the world. So the very presumptions of these two ways of looking at life, the American way or the Enlightenment way, but let's say the American way and the Jewish way, are very much at odds with each other. And what that means for us, as American Jews, is that we have always had to try to balance one side of the American side of our identity with the Jewish side of identity, and in some way or another to integrate them. One of the favorite readings in the Silverman Prayer Book that was used in the conservative movement from its publication in 1946 until Sidur Sim Shalom came out in 1975, was a reading called America Founded on Biblical Precepts that was written by Rabbi Morris Silverman. And I grew up in Milwaukee. My hometown rabbi loved that reading. So not just on Thanksgiving, but services, but often on Friday nights, we would read this thing in which there would be something from American heritage, followed by something from Jewish heritage, the point of which was saying one is the same as the other, right? And certainly American Jews in Kaplan's generation and in my parents' generation really wanted to believe that, namely that my Jewish identity and my American identity are one and the same. And therefore I should feel completely comfortable in America as a Jew. The problem is, and by the way, that reading got reprinted in Sidur Sim Shalom. It's on page 821 if you want to look at it. And a shortened version of it got reprinted in Sidur Lev Shalem, the one that came out in 2013. It's on page 453 of that, right? It's a shortened version, but still the same idea, that my identity as an American and my identity as a Jew are one and the same. The problem is that that's just not the case, and that the way in which, if you start out with a position of rights, it's really rather different from when you start out with a position of duties, and we always have had to balance that kind of thing, right? So what does that come to mean? Well, in America and in Israel, it has come to mean different things. One of a very, very nice article that was published in the Jewish Journal here in Los Angeles in September was by a man by the name of Samuel Hyde, in which he was asking, why is it that in 1948, when Israel was, invaded by armies surrounding it, when it set up its government, it was a democratic government. How did that happen? So one theory is, well, it's based on Salam Elohim. We're all individuals created in the image of God. The problem is that if you want to use that as the basis, and you look to the Bible, there's no democracy in the Bible, right? There are monarchies, and there's a Kohanite that was completely based upon who your father was, actually, right? It was genealogy. So there's no democracy at all in the Bible. And later on in the Hasmonean period, the other time in which we had governance over ourselves, that too was not a democracy. So it can't be just based upon Salam Elohim. And the other kind of thing that one might think about, was the issue of the fact that the people who came to Israel might have come from countries in which they had democracies. But the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of Jews who came to Israel in 1948 and shortly thereafter came from Eastern European countries, not Western European countries, and from Arab lands, and none of which was democratic. So how is it that immediately in 1948 you get a democracy in Israel? And Samuel Hyde's claim is that it's because Jews had a lot of experience with democracy through the Middle Ages. And the reason is because they needed a place to worship and they needed to have schools for their kids, right? And so they needed to come together as communities. And what you got as a result was this Kehillah structure, Kahal actually was called very often, but in Eastern Europe and throughout Arab lands, in which people had to come together and figure out how they were going to do this, right? And so you already get a system of self-determination among Jews, self-rule among Jews, that was democratic because there was no other way of creating these kinds of communal structures. And so you get the system was not based on rabbinical authority, but on the people's ability to elect their own leaders. I'm quoting from him now. Sometimes the elected leaders were rabbis and sometimes not. Some communities were more egalitarian and some were less. Some were more oligarchic and allowed members of the same family to be continually elected, and some were less oligarchic and placed limits on the members of any family that could be elected at any given time to community leadership. But if you look at the histories of these Jewish communities, each of them operated as a little bit of a city-state, or a polis, if you wish. Jewish people might not have had a state, but they had been adopting community politics in the normative ways of modern elective democracies for centuries. The electoral systems were not short of political fights or cliques, and there were all the nice and nasty aspects of modern democratic politics that one finds in Israel today. People seceded from a community because they didn't like the leader of the community, Rabbi, and moved across the street or to a nearby hill and set up a different community. It was through this process that Jews became articulate in their understanding of how to elect, create coalitions, fight the opposition, and create a basic consensus of voluntary taxation, right? So this history of being democratic, because you had no choice in the matter, right, for at least the last 1,000 years, right, is what really creates in us a sense of that democracy is the way to go. That in order to be able to run societies, we really need to do it based upon that. But and it's one thing when you're in the majority, and even there in Israel, there are real questions. There's 20% of the Israeli population is not Jewish, right? And so, and among the Jews, of course, as usual, there are major divisions in terms of how you are Jewish and what a Jewish state ought to look like, right? So in the Jewish, even within the 80% or so that are Jewish, you get major questions about what democracy should look like. But in America, where we are a very small minority, the question is, you know, how do you function as a Jew as a very small majority in a majority culture? I'm 79 years old. You don't have to guess, and I'm of a generation that applauded as the Warren Supreme Court made major distinctions between, you know, religion and state, and really tried to buttress that wall between religion and state. I still remember when prayer in the public schools was no longer allowed, right? Where you could get release time, and actually the Hebrew school that I attended started at 4 o'clock, and the elementary school and later junior high school ended at 3:30, but it was it took an extra 15 minutes to walk to Hebrew school, so I got out at 3:15, right, as part of release time, right? There was, but there was supposed to be religious education was in religious institutions, whereas the public school was supposed to be completely separate from that. So I grew up really believing in this very, you know, Jeffersonian wall between religion and state. But then I got appointed to 3 different federal commissions and 1 state of California commission, in which all of that became very problematic. I was on the ethics committee of Hillary Clinton's healthcare task force. May it rest in peace. The ethics committee consisted of I think it was 5 physicians and several nurses, a number of public policy people, and a Protestant, a Catholic, and a Jew. Now there are also 5 secular ethicists. I have a PhD in philosophy from Columbia with a dissertation in moral philosophy, but I wasn't there as an ethicist. I was there as a rabbi. So that was my first taste of the fact that this was not such a big separation between church and state. And then I was on a commission to try to diminish the spread of sexually transmitted diseases. There again, there were secular ethicists on the committee, but I was the rabbi, right? And then finally, I was on a commission to review and revise the federal guidelines on research on human subjects. And I found myself really, given what the Nazis had done to us in the Nazi experiments, to be especially sensitive to that issue, right? For reasons that I could actually, as a rabbi, bring to the attention of the committee. And then now I'm on this commission, I've been for about the last 10 years, for the state of California for regulating embryonic stem cell research in the state of California. And the very legislation that created it, there are 12 people on the committee, 2 of them are secular ethicists, and there have to be 2 representatives of religious groups. And that's why I'm on it. Right? Now, where did the separation between church and state come from? You know, where is that? And these are, by the way, in democratic, these are not Republican administrations. These are democratic administrations that created all of these bodies. It was the Clinton administration for the first 3, and the Jerry Brown's administration in the state of California. So what is this, right? I think what what really I think is the right way is what Jefferson thought a long time ago. Jefferson thought that there should be a very strong separation between church and state, but that in the running of the state, there should be no establishment. Remember the First Amendment, right? There should be the establishment clause that no religion should establish what public policy should be. But it should be the case that when people come to think about public matters, they should bring with them at the entirety of themselves. It should not be what Richard John Newhouse later said and talked about as a naked public square. That is, that the public square should be without input from any of the various religious parts of the United States. But that rather, if you're going to get wisdom in public policy, it's got to be everybody arguing with each other. It's almost Talmudic, actually, right? That the way you're going to get it, it is also Aristotelian, that the way that you're going to get real wisdom is not that you have a philosopher king or an elected king, as it were, right, or queen for that matter, that the way you would get wisdom in public policy is by people arguing with each other and coming with it with the fullness of their points of view with respect for each other. I mean, you have to know how to argue and you have to know how to listen to other people with respect for each other, but also with the fullness of their particular views. So I think that that really is what the Jewish tradition brings to public policy, namely a sense that what it means to be a minority, what it means to have real values that are our values, which may be very different, and we need to respect other people's values, and then be able to argue with them about it. I teach a course for rabbinical students, which includes some of the ethical import of the Jewish tradition. And when we were talking about Judaism and poverty, and Judaism requires a very thick safety net for people who are poor. A student of mine who was a convert to Judaism, whose parents were Texas evangelical Christians, said to me, my parents would think this is crazy. People should take care of themselves and have the responsibility to take care of themselves. The notion that a community should be responsible for supporting its poor would just be crazy. So I said to him, well, what about Rick Warren, an evangelical preacher in Orange County here in California, who is really trying to get evangelicals to deal with poverty? And my student said, my parents would say, well, that's that California pastor, right? He doesn't really know what evangelical Christianity is supposed to be about, right? So you need to understand that there are people in this world who really do not look at the world in the way that Judaism does. And you've got to come to interact with them with respect, and then try to figure out how public policy ought to happen. By the way, the same sort of thing happens in Jewish institutions. I'm a past president and still very much a member of the board of Jewish Family Service here. And one of the real issues that we have is we get 85% of our budget from government subsidies of various sorts, right? Various programs. So that means automatically that all of those programs are open to anybody who walks in the door, right? More than that, we really need to try to service people beyond the Jewish community, right? And so we do. And so we run an agency of about $35 million budget each year, right? Some of the programs are 100% Jewish for Holocaust survivors. Some of them are close to 100% not Jewish. We run the Sova pantries for people who are poor. There are some Jewish clients, but because Jews are not all rich by any means, right? But the vast majority of people who come to them are not Jewish. We run 3 shelters for people who are subject to family violence. The vast majority of those clients are not Jewish, right? And yet it is a Jewish agency that's running the Jewish Family Service, that's running these programs. So what is it in the Jewish tradition that makes us want to do that and spend a lot of money doing that, including money, the other 15% that's donated by Jews, right? Or by the Jewish Federation. Well, that goes back to really doing the kind of depth theology in the Jewish tradition that would get us to see that, well, it goes back to the Tosefta, 2nd century source, that we have to take care of the poor of the non-Jewish community, the sick of the non-Jewish community, help them to mourn their dead and bury them, right? I can guarantee you that the Romans were not treating the Jews that way, right? When that Tosefta was written. So what is it in the Jewish tradition that gets us to be concerned about non-Jews and their issues as well as our own? Now, we do have to take care of ourselves, and the way that the Jewish tradition sees it is in concentric circles. You have to take care of yourself first, chayacha kodmim, and then your immediate family, and then the local Jewish community, then the larger Jewish community, and then the non-Jewish community. But you do have a responsibility as a Jew to take care of the non-Jewish community as well. So this kind of balancing act that we as American Jews are called to do, I think is in government service in terms of policy making and in terms of how we as Jews run our own communities. I'm going to stop there.
Okay. Thank you so much, Elliot. You both have given some real food for thought on, both the tensions between Jewish and American identity and are they complementary? Are they not? How does this all intersect with democracy? And I think before I start asking specific questions, I'd actually like to give you each just a few minutes to respond to something the other has said, either to disagree, to rebut, possibly to agree. I leave it up to you. I think I'd like to introduce a little bit of elements of Hurwitz into this. So I'm going to do this both. So I will actually start with Sid, since Elliot just went, and then Elliot, we'll go to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Elliot, you've literally written the book on the distinction between rights and responsibilities, where Judaism prioritizes responsibilities and American democracy prioritizes rights. I guess I would argue today, and love to get your reaction to it, that we can no longer be dispassionate about making that observation, that America's refusal to take seriously the public square and the common good is essentially ruining our country. And whether we look at the Second Amendment, that the right to own a gun is more important than the safety of individuals, including school children who are at risk. There are now more guns in America than there are human beings. Or take our reaction to the pandemic, where our vaccination rates were so low because people said, I don't trust the government and they're not going to tell me to put a shot in my arm. Now Israel's got its own problems with democracy, but on the pandemic, there is in Israel, because, and there's some reasons I would argue it, I won't go into length here, there is a strong sense of the common good in Israel. And so the vaccination rates were twice as high in places like Israel or Portugal, where Jane was calling in from, by the way, when people have a sense that they have a responsibility to the society at large. There's this Edelman Trust Index that you may be aware of. Trust in government and public institutions is at an all-time low. And we are essentially putting our whole democracy at risk because people feel, don't tell me what to do. And as a result, we've lost all sense about what the common good needs.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. And I think it's horrendous. And I think what Jews can bring to the public square is exactly that kind of sensitivity, right? That we're not in this alone. We don't live on isolated islands, right? If we have rights at all, they are rights that need to be constricted by our responsibilities to each other, right? And a right to, well, and I think, frankly, I think the Supreme Court understood the Second Amendment incorrectly to begin with. And the Second Amendment is talking about a militia, and it's talking about muskets. It's not talking about individuals with AR-15s. I mean, that's a whole other story, right? But the point is that I think you are right. I think that one of the things that we Jews can bring to the American policy making situation, and by the way, to American institutions, is a real sense of community and community responsibility that comes in our tradition. That said, as an American, I mean, I'm very proud to be an American, not because I think America has done everything right. I don't think anybody has done everything right. We're human beings after all. But we live in the most pluralistic country that has ever existed on the face of the earth. I do a lot of interfaith work, and a priest friend of mine told me that in the Los Angeles Archdiocese, Mass is offered in 80 different languages, right? Now, what that means is, and we somehow or another get along together. Now, there have been major bumps along the way. Slavery, of course, is a major one. Anti-Semitism in the 20s and 30s, and unfortunately rearing its head again right now, is another one, right? It's not that we have a perfect society, but we by and large are not killing each other, even though we come, some people do. So I'm very proud of being part of the most pluralistic society that's ever existed on the face of the earth. And American individualism does provide American pragmatism and American creativity. We create the vast majority of technical advances in the world, medical advances in the world, talking about vaccines, right? And that doesn't come from communitarianism. That comes from individualism, and it comes from capitalism, not socialism. Now, I think those things have to be reined in somewhat in order for a society to be able to live together. But I think one needs to also understand and appreciate what American individualism and American pragmatism has given all of us, right? And the real question is, how do you balance that with taking care of the poor and the sick and getting people to think more about their obligations to other people? Sarah, you're muted.
I'm sorry, I thought I unmuted myself. Thank you to both of you. I actually want to start with a question that gets to what Sid was talking about, referencing Kaplan, about our collective consciousness. I think a lot about the rise of social media and how different working in politics is today than when it was back when I first started out. Years ago, when you were working on a political campaign, you were conscious that your ways of communicating to the American people were a few evening news shows and the morning newspapers. And that was pretty much it. And the people who published, the people who were allowed to speak it through those venues, they were highly filtered. They were fact-checked. There were certain standards of journalistic, integrity that they were following. They had other problems. They weren't particularly diverse. We can certainly critique them, but there was some kind of filter. And I sort of looked to later campaigns that I worked on, like the 2008 Obama campaign. You saw a real rise of social media. We were certainly conscious that you had to think about the mainstream media and you had to engage with them, but you also had Twitter, Facebook, just name every social media site where basically anyone can have a platform. Fact-checking, journalistic standards, just not much of a thing. You have algorithms that are privileging the most extreme and inflammatory speakers. And, the result is that we have this kind of post-truth society where, everyone kind of has their own facts. And, we don't really, if you're going to ask, what is the collective consciousness of America? I don't know if you can say that there really is one. Of course, there have always been fringe views. There have always been people on the margins in their thinking. But I do think years ago, there was some body of facts from which we were working. And today, there really isn't. On the Jewish side as well, thinking about a collective Jewish consciousness, I personally am very concerned about the challenge of Jewish illiteracy. I honestly, I haven't been able to find data on this, but I think probably the majority of American Jews don't really know what the Torah is or what it says. They have a sense, it's in Hebrew on the scrolls, we read from it in the synagogue, but I don't think they really quite know. I think if we get to the Talmud, then you're really shrinking it to a pretty small minority. And so if we talk about bringing Jewish values into the public sphere, and if we talk about what that sphere actually consists of, we're running into a real lack of knowledge, a lack of facts, a real disagreement. And so I'm curious for each of you, how does that rise of social media shape your own thinking about American democracy and the ways that Jews can influence it and bring Jewish wisdom and values to bear on it? And whoever wants to go first can go.
Well, I've got probably a dozen members of Adat Shalom on this call who heard me in my Kol Nidre sermon give a to-do list at the end of the sermon, first of which was to get off social media. And I said it a bit more nuanced than that, but I really believe that it is poisoning our souls and poisoning our society. And by the way, this is before Elon Musk went through with his purchase of Twitter, and before Kanye West has now invested in bought Parler, which is one of the most extreme websites that gives total platform to white nationalist writers. I think, I don't know what the solution is. I do think that Congress could have moved more quickly to provide some regulation to social media. You know, at the beginning part of the 20th century, there was an understanding about the harm of robber barons to American capitalism, and so they were reined in with antitrust laws, whatever else. The government can and should be stepping in when you have a handful of people controlling the platform for information in our country. And nothing has happened, and it's getting worse with the new developments that I just mentioned a moment ago. I wish I knew more about this, but from the other side of the pond, when I look at something like the BBC, the fact that the UK has invested in a news service that can be trusted, as opposed to warring factions that we have in the current environment. I'm sure people have written stories about why the BBC is not helpful. Canada has something similar to what UK has. But the vanishing of independent journalism in America is a very serious threat, especially on the local level. It is really hard to get any information about local candidates, local campaigns, whether it's school board or county councils, whatever else. I know in my own area, and I live in a media hub, all the local journalism has dried up. And unless there's some major entry of either government or nonprofits into that space, we are in what you correctly termed, Sarah, a post-truth society. I don't know how any society or democracy can survive when people don't know what the truth is.
Amen to that, absolutely. And as a philosopher, one of the areas of philosophy is epistemology. How do you know what's true and what's not, right? But I mean, I think the Jewish tradition, the Talmud says that one of the names of God is emet, is truth. And the tradition is very much, the Jewish tradition has an ethics of language that is far more sophisticated and nuanced than the American law, which is only against slander and libel. But in the Jewish tradition, there are all kinds of things that you might be tempted to say that you may not say. And there are, it's not only lies that you may not say, but you may not say negative things about somebody else that happen to be true if the other person doesn't have a practical need to know them. That's called lashon hara, right? Negative speech about somebody. And there's even a prohibition against a vak lashon hara, the dust of negative speeches. This time he got it right. Right. So you get a sense that it's you're denigrating other people in that kind of way, and it gets really, really difficult not only on a political level, but also on a personal level. I wrote a rabbinic ruling for the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards on harmful speech. And one of those pieces has to do with the kind of bullying that's going on among our kids, right? When it used to be just, somebody said something nasty to somebody else, and so only the people in the nearby vicinity were able to hear it. That was bad enough, but now it goes viral in seconds, and people's sense of self-worth and people's reputation are destroyed in an instant. Mm-hmm. And it's really not, and you can't rebuild that. I mean, it's that old Hasidic story about take the pillow and spread the feathers, and once you can't get the feathers back again, right? Well, it's the same sort of thing with the internet now, where our kids, and especially our teenagers and our young people, are really at the mercy of what anybody says on any time, whether it's truthful or not, and whether it is shaming or not. That's a terrible society to grow up in, right? I mean, if Tselem Elohim means anything, it means that we've got to have a sense of respect for others and a sense of respect for ourselves. I do a little bit of criminology, and one of the things that characterizes a large number of people in prison is they have no sense of self-worth. And that's the reason why they do to other, because they assume that other people aren't worth anything either. And therefore you can do to them whatever you want to do to them, right? So, I mean, I think that the kind of, well, Sid, I took your advice. I had a Facebook account that I have not used since I started it, right? I don't have a TikTok account. I don't have whatever else there is. I just don't. Now, of course, I'm old, but still, right? I mean, I think I'm frankly, it's a matter of self-defense to a certain extent that I just don't engage in this stuff.
Let me just add one thought, Sarah, if I can. I want to mention we now have evidence that Donald Trump made a decision that before the 2020 election came to the vote, that he was going to deny any validity of a result that would not have made him have a second term, okay? And now that's a part of a playbook that is going to be played out across America now, okay?
Yeah.
Any basis of democracy is the peaceful transfer of power. And now we have a president whose very presidency is being questioned by the other side because it was not a legitimate acceptance of that, unlike what happened with Al Gore, who had many reasons to challenge the Bush-Gore election, but he understood that democracy was more important than him winning a court case. And so he stepped back and allowed George Bush to become president. We're in a very different day now, and it's very dangerous.
Yes.
I could not agree more. Actually, just leaning more into what we're talking about now with the way that our democratic discourse is playing out. I think about the way that traditional Jewish discourse works, and it's very, there is a huge emphasis on an openness to opposing opinions. It is, in a way, if when you study Talmud, it's playful, it's experimental. Well, what if X? Okay, well, what if this challenge to X? Well, what if Y? And soon you're on a boat with a snake and wine, and you've got the exception to the exception. But there's a real a resilience, an openness to being challenged. And I think that what we see today is, some people call it cancel culture. I'm not sure if I find that phrase helpful, but there is a sense of, that's not really how we engage anymore. It's a sense of, if maybe you want to challenge something, it's like, oh, you're a racist, or you hate Israel, or whatever it is. We shut people down with name calling. There is a sense of, we don't have that openness, that experimental kind of discourse, that playfulness, that willingness to challenge and to sharpen each other, to be changed by each other. And I'm wondering, as you think about this sort of new kind of very rigid, fearful discourse in which a lot of us engage, where we do censor ourselves, we're afraid of offending, of being misinterpreted, how do you see that affecting our ability to have a rich democratic discourse? How, I'm curious about your thoughts on Jewish discourse and how that interplays with democratic discourse today.
Well, let me give you a true story, okay? In 1996, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, which is about 70% of America's Lutherans, officially repudiated Luther's anti-Semitic comments. I mean, not a small thing, right, for the origin of their religion. And they created a Lutheran commission of theologians to create a new Lutheran theology about Jews and Judaism. And they asked 6 of us who do Jewish theology to meet with them for 3 days at Gustavus Adolphus College. It's a Lutheran college about an hour and a half southwest of the Minneapolis airport. And the way that they had set it up was that on the first morning, one of the 6 of us Jews would talk about a particular topic, and then the rest of the morning would be a discussion of that topic with the Lutheran theologians, and the second topic in the afternoon, and so on. So the first morning, it was Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, who many of you know is really smart, really learned, a wonderful guy, right? So he gave his talk for about an hour about whatever the topic was. And then after he finished, the other 5 of us said, well, it's not quite that way. And, we went on our thing, why did you interpret this source this way? Why didn't you interpret it another way? What happens with this source that you didn't mention, and all of that. About an hour later, we looked up, and these 15 Lutheran theologians were absolutely bug-eyed. One of them said to me, I actually thought you were going to strangle each other at any moment, right? Because if you are Lutheran, especially Scandinavian Lutheran, you don't argue in public. You stare, you glare, you get an ulcer, but you don't argue in public, right? So one of the things we had to teach each other is, how do you respect each other, right? In the Lutheran community, you respect each other by just not saying anything. In our community, you respect each other by listening and asking for more information, challenging, all of that, right? It's a completely different way of showing respect for somebody else, right? One other story. The year before COVID, the Brentwood Presbyterian Church, which has services from 9 to 10 and from 11 to 12 every Sunday morning, has adult education from 10 to 11. So the year before COVID, they were doing the religions of the world. So they asked me to do Judaism in an hour. Okay. So I said to them, before I give you any of the content of the tradition, you need to know its mode. Its mode is very argumentative. It loves an argument as a way of respecting each other. So at the end, then I talked about God Torah Israel. So at the end of it, a man in his late 50s came up to me and he said, now I understand something. I said, what do you understand? He said that he was an aeronautical engineer at Northrop Grumman. These are the people that put things up in the sky, you know, with JPL and all of that. He said, in my 30 some years at JPL, whenever I suggested that we do something differently, I would get slammed down, except when I had a Jewish boss. So this ability to challenge and to argue and to respect while arguing, right, is a very precious Jewish piece of it. But you need to know that the vast majority of cultures are not like that. The vast majority of cultures are, you accept what you're told. A priest with whom I do some work with teachers in Catholic schools, most of whom themselves are Catholic, say to his fellow Catholics, we Catholics are good at reception. We receive what we are told. At which point I tell them, Jews are terrible at reception. We question everything, right? But that's true also for evangelical Christians, and it's true for Muslims, and it's true for Buddhists, and so on down the line. You accept what you are told, right? Now that's very problematic if you're trying to get to truth or wisdom or goodness, right? And I think, frankly, the Jewish way of doing it is far better. But you need to understand that democracy is based on this same kind of ability to argue and to come to some kind of an agreement. But that's something that I think we Jews really need to teach our fellow Americans.
Yeah, I would just add that we have seen in the past 25 years the virtual disappearance of the mythic American public square, where people from different backgrounds, faiths, ethnic groups, whatever else, came to debate the future of the common good with respect for each other's opinions. That's gone. Whether you look at Congress, which through gerrymandering, there are fewer and fewer contested races now because of gerrymandering, which have been done by Democrats and Republicans, okay? Or here again, we can point a finger at both rights, people, liberals and conservatives, whether it's conservatives who are taking over school boards and taking off the shelves of school libraries books about LGBT lifestyle or critical race theory, or people on the progressive left who have a certain, doctrinaire approach, which is, akin to, I would argue sometimes, Mao's cultural revolution. Here's the truth according to progressives, and if you don't follow that party line, I'm not sure why you don't like the term cancel culture, Sarah, because that is what happens. If you don't follow the party line, your view is no longer accepted or honored in that space. So this tolerance for debate and difference and seeing it as a virtue as opposed to something that is dangerous is yet another indicator of the unhealth of America's democracy.
I mean, this is the problem with in addition to being in a post-truth society, even when we do actually have some facts at our disposal, the way we engage in discourse about those facts it's not particularly helpful, right? I will scream my facts, you will scream your facts. I won't listen to you. We won't actually engage in kind of challenging each other's facts, coming up with a deeper truth as we do in Chavruta, argument for the sake of heaven. And that's obviously a real loss for our democracy. Well, I am going to now turn this over to Jeffrey, and he is going to be taking audience questions. Thank you both so much for a really rich, wonderful conversation. I took copious notes during both of your presentations, so much to think about, and it's just a joy to be in conversation with the two of you.
I took the opportunity to do a big thumbs up in my screen in appreciation of Sarah, Sid, and Elliot. I think it's been a really rich dialogue. I want to catch you up to some exchanges that have been going on in the chat room. There's most recently been a volley of comments that in order to respect people, you have to first listen to them. And those skills of deep listening are short these days. There's also a generational thing that I keep hearing here. I'll preface it by saying when I used to do a survey with boomers and millennials about the value of a smartphone, if I asked boomers, would you rather lose your arm or your smartphone? They would mostly say, I'd rather lose my smartphone. But millennials and Gen Z folks would rather lose their arm. I mean, social media is part of how they live. And there were some comments in the kind of fiddler on the one hand, on the other hand mode of, yes, it's true, but I belong to communities who have led people back to Judaism, young communities, because they're established on the basis of social media. And I hope people won't be forgetting those. So a rich exchange, and we will send you the transcript of that, because I'm certainly not going to pick up on all the comments. There are a couple of particular things I want to get back to Sid and Elliot about. One question was someone wanted to know, would you consider an establishment of a ban on abortion the establishment of a state religion?
Yes, very much so.
Yes.
Because what it does is that it puts into law one particular way of looking at fetal development. I mean, the issue in regard to abortion is not one of biological facts. I mean, I think everybody agrees that, or at least everybody that knows anything about the biology agrees that you have the, sperm and egg come together, whether in a woman's uterus or in a petri dish for in vitro fertilization, and they develop over a period of time. And we even have pictures of that development. That goes back to Look magazine in 1964 that had the very first pictures of fetal development. And now we have, I mean, some of you may have seen the bodywork exhibit that's gone around the country where you can actually see what a fetus looks like at different stages. So, I mean, the issue is not biology. The issue is metaphysics. That is a level above physics. That is, how do you categorize the various stages of fetal development? And that is, I mean, the Roman Catholic Church is on one end of that, and Roe v. Wade was on the other end of that. And it's not really on the other end of that. They're actually more, Marianne Warren, for example, wrote that it's not, you don't have a human being until 30 days after death, which in some ways is like Jewish law, that you don't have full burial rights in Shiva until the child was survived for 30 days outside the womb. So, I mean, there are all kinds of ways of looking at this. And I think, again, Jefferson was right. Jefferson said that when Americans largely agree on particular moral issues, then you can have laws about them. So there can be laws against murder and theft and rape and fraud and things like that, and laws requiring people to pay taxes and educate their children, right? But where Americans disagree, then the state should stay out of it. Jefferson said that, and I think it was absolutely right, and that's true for abortion generally, as one of the examples of that, namely that it really should be up to individuals to do that. Now, that said, the Jewish tradition does not argue for abortion on demand. The Jewish tradition says that, first of all, the Jewish tradition says that the very first chapter of Genesis, pru, be fruitful and multiply. So there's an obligation to procreate in our tradition, right? And we as Jews, by the way, are in deep demographic crisis. We are, setting aside replacing the 6 million that we lost in the Holocaust, we're not even replacing ourselves now, right? We have, in America, among American Jews, we have about a 1.8 reproductive rate, where in order to simply reproduce yourselves, you have to have about a 2.1 to 2.2 children per couple, obviously, right? Without the Orthodox, it would be even less than 1.8. So we are really, unfortunately, doing Hitler's work for him in a much more subtle way than he ever imagined with the gas chambers. We are cutting ourselves off for people, ourselves off as a people. So I think that needs to be balanced against the issues of abortion. Now, abortion is required in Jewish law if the mother's life or health is at stake. It's permitted if there is an elevated risk to the woman beyond that of normal pregnancy. For example, if she's diabetic, then she needs to have more doctoral supervision during pregnancy than most women need to have, right? But by and large, it is not allowed in the Jewish tradition, except for saving the life or health of the mother. And in terms of some modern tshuva, now that we have sonograms and things like that, we can. There are also many rabbis that would allow abortion for fetal abnormalities. But those are, you need to understand that the Jewish tradition is pro-choice in terms of American identity. As an American, I want the government to stay out of this, okay? But now as a Jew, as a rabbi talking to my fellow Jews, especially to my young fellow Jews, right? They're postponing marriage far too long, right? I would love to be able to tell them that they can have children anytime they want. But the ability to procreate diminishes over time. And it's not only women, it's men's ability to procreate also diminishes over time. So postponing marriage until the 30s or 40s and then expecting to have children is just not in the cards for most people. And then they end up in my office and yours, Jeff's, and yours, Sid's, right? You know, how can we maintain our marriage if we can't have the children we expected to have? At least the major question.
Thanks for your erudition, scholarship. And Sid, do you want to respond to that question as well? Is it, in fact, the establishment of religion to enact laws that prohibit abortion and hence against the spirit of the Constitution?
Well, even though we've raised the notion of the benefit of disagreement here, I wouldn't dare. Elliot is both an expert in Jewish medical ethics and in Jewish law and American constitutional law. So I'm not weighing in with the giant having weighed in here. I just agree with Elliot. It's fine.
Okay, thank you. Another question came, a historical question. Someone wondered whether when the state of Israel was established, was it influenced by any American or European notions of democracy? Was there that kind of transfusion of American values into the growing Jewish state in Israel?
Well, the article that I quoted by Samuel Hyde, Hyde, would indicate otherwise, right? Namely that what was really going on there, both in the Yishuv before 1948 and the Jewish settlement before 1908, where you had kibbutzim that were democratic, right? And not quite, I mean, a number of them were socialists, but they were democratic socialists, right? In other words, they were not, that's a long story. But anyway, and you did have Mapam, you did have communist kibbutzim, right? But the vast majority of what was going on in the Yishuv beforehand was democratic. And that, he argues, is a function of the 1,000 years or so of Jews living in the diaspora that needed to organize themselves in order to provide synagogues and schools for their communities. So, I mean, I think he's right. I think that was really the much more of an influence on early Israel than either what was going on in the United States or elsewhere. Now, the Brits did rule Israel from the end of the Ottoman Empire until 1948. So they did at least see a British form of democracy. But the Brits were not kind to the Jews at that time, as you may remember. And so I don't think that evidence of British rule was seen as being a good thing. I think to the extent that they were democratic, it was largely from their own Jewish experience.
Yeah, I don't. I haven't read comprehensively all of Zionist theory, but I've read a lot of it. I've never seen much of any references to American democracy. I think the first place you'll find that in Israel is in decisions of the Supreme Court in Israel. There's been a citation of a good number of precedents from American constitutional law. So I think that's been introduced, and I think the Supreme Court, I used to quip, not totally without intent, that we should take some of the decisions of the Israeli Supreme Court and put Trump to it and chant them for Haftarot, because they're so unbelievably inspired. And I think they've written a new prophetic literature in the modern period, which is almost totally unknown to American Jews. The fact that there's no place in the American Jewish educational establishment where we've learned Israeli Supreme Court decisions is nothing short of criminal, because it's brilliant work that's been done there by some real gedolim, some real giants.
So thanks for that perspective. I want to return to Israel when we conclude. I also want to take a few minutes to offer what I think might be a different Kaplanian perspective. It builds on some of your initial comments, Sid, that at one time historically, it may have been to our advantage as a people to think of our Americanness and our Jewishness as two pieces of a puzzle fitting exactly together, seamless. In fact, there's a wonderful paean to that by Milton Steinberg in A Partisan Guide to the Jewish Problem, that there's no tension at all between those two. I think that's not the most dynamic way to see it. And I think there are other threads within Kaplan that expected a kind of interchange between our Americanism and our Judaism. And I would suggest, because this is part of our ongoing analysis at the Kaplan Center, that one thing Kaplan might embrace is that Judaism learned, I don't want to use democracy, I want to use volunteerism, that Alexis de Tocqueville in his Democracy in America talks about the extraordinary volunteerism that marks American society. I think one might say that Judaism has benefited that in enormous and important ways over time, and reciprocally, the gift that Judaism offers Americanism is along the lines that Elliot laid out, the importance of community and responsibilities. And this potential symbiosis or mutual exchange of virtues is part of what we ought to keep in mind, the Gadol, in the biggest, broadest way. I want to turn, and I include Sarah here and Sophie if she'd like to chime in. When I began my dialogues with Sid and Elliot, email exchanges, and we framed the title of this webinar in the Heichal, in the Heichal of democracy, of the voting booth, we were so very aware that this webinar was happening 9 days before the elections in America. And we wanted to explore, as Lauren did a bit, the relationship between the resilience and fragility of the Sukkah as an image and experience and democracy. They are both extraordinarily resilient and extraordinarily fragile. Well, my great moment of discovery, and I'm turning back to all the wisdom among the three of you, is this morning I was brought up short by the fact that when we thought about this, we were thinking about democracy as it unfolds in America. And the Washington Post Weekly Journal had a wonderful article about, guess what? In 2 days, Israel, a country we care about, and a system of values and democracy is going to the voting booth. So I would like to ask if any of the three of you or four of you have a notion of what democracy is more fragile or resilient, our American democracy or democracy as it plays out in Israel?
Sarah, do you want to go first, Sarah?
No. I mean, what a question. I just came back from Israel actually from a week-long trip with the Schusterman Foundation, and very much aware of the elections happening there. I don't have anywhere near the expertise or background to compare the two democracies, but I will say it is deeply troubling seeing it is deeply troubling seeing some of the same trends in each, just these kind of extremist folks becoming somewhat mainstream, whipping up this kind of, identity politics, whipping up these sort of nationalist sentiments, and it's worrisome. I think you see it in both countries are very different. I certainly don't want to imply that they're identical, but I think seeing aspects of both of these in both countries was deeply troubling. So I have a lot of concerns about the health of both countries, but I defer to others for the comparative analysis.
Hey, there's no single expertise here. So, Elliot and Sid, do you have a
Yeah.
perspective to offer us?
I first want to comment on the first part, and then I want to talk about the comment on your Israel-America question, because
Okay.
this is important to me. I do want to observe that there was a fascination, if not an obsession, in the American Jewish mind for the better part of a century about proving about how complementary, LE, America and Judaism was. You know, you don't even stop with Kaplan. Whether it's Horace Kalin or Milton Convitz, you got the three Ks there, KKK, Kaplan, Convitz, and Kalin, probably the three giants who spent a lifetime trying to show how sympathetic America was to Judaism. And I'm convinced that that was part of a narrative that first generation American Jews needed to hear to justify our place in America. And I think, although we stand on the shoulders of those giants, that analysis is passé. I'm not saying it's inaccurate, but I don't think anymore, not even my generation, and for sure not my children's generation, needs to hear sermons or read books about how Americanism and Judaism are complementary. I've argued in my last book, Jewish Megatrends, that a vital Judaism requires us to declare boldly and courageously and clearly that Judaism is countercultural to America for exactly the reasons that Elliot taught earlier in this panel, okay? We have certain things that actually could improve America's democracy, okay? Not just the notion of duties and obligations, but a lot of other things as well. And I think for Jews who are fully accepted into America, no longer, and of course, we know about the rise of anti-Semitism right now, but still, there's really no aspect of American society where Jews have not entered into the top echelon, okay? And for Jews of that, of the current generation, to hear lectures about how we're the same as America is not going to get them into the places that teach more about Judaism. It's to say rather that we have a different way of thinking about how societies need to work. And I think we need to have the self-confidence of our place in America to kind of bring that lesson into the conversation about America's future. With regard to Israel and America, I don't really want to stop there. The fact of the matter is democracy is under assault throughout the world now. You have the rise of autocrats who use identity politics, fear, as a strategy, as a weapon to essentially undermine the democratic principles that we thought were part of our future, and we were wrong about that. I mean, go back to Francis Fukuyama, okay, the end of civilization. He was arguing that essentially Western Enlightenment ideals have won out, okay, so game's over, now we can kind of open the next chapter. Well, Fukuyama was wrong. Everything that we base American Western, the world's Western liberal Enlightenment values on is under assault now, not just in Israel and America, but around the world. And it's a very, very scary thing.
Elliot, would you like to weigh in here?
Yeah, no, I agree with what Sid said completely. And it's, you know, I'm old enough to remember that when I was in college in the 60s, Congress was able to pass the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, that was during the Johnson administration, the Environmental Protection Act, and the Clear Waters Act and the Nixon administration. I mean, you were able to get, you know, I wouldn't say it was, you know, kumbaya or anything like that. This was also the era of Vietnam, after all, right? It was certainly not that, but it was, I mean, it wasn't just smooth and everybody was in some kind of Camelot environment, although Camelot came out of the 60s. It was a great musical, by the way. But the point is that, I mean, there were Republicans and Democrats were able to work together toward common goals in a way that we really have not seen a lot of in the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years. And it's very troubling. It really is. And it's just, it's not good for anybody. I mean, it's not as if somebody's, you know, gaining at the expense of somebody else. It's just not good for America at all. And what we really need to do is to try to yell and scream and do whatever we possibly can do to remind Americans that we're in this together and that we really better work together, or otherwise we're all going to sink.
Thank you. I'm going to bring this to close in a minute with the caveat that people are free to stay around for an additional 15 minutes and ask questions that you haven't yet had a chance to formulate, respond to others. But I would be remiss in my responsibilities to the Kaplan Center if I didn't point out that this dialogue is going to continue on Sunday, December 11th, as we approach Hanukkah. And the webinar will be with Rabbis James Green, Jessica Lott, myself, and a yet to be named mystery guest star. And it's building on this dialogue in a way. Is there a friendly critique, or even a not friendly critique, but an honest, intellectually trenchant critique that we can make of the notion of living in two civilizations, which is at a core notion of Kaplan's thought? So we will be exploring that. I note for myself that it's always interesting and pretty easy to see the confluence and the sharing and compatibility of Americanism and Judaism around Thanksgiving time for a lot of reasons. At our next seminar, we'll be approaching Hanukkah. When Hanukkah coincides with Christmas, it makes for a very different kind of challenge. So those dialogues are ongoing, and I hope people will join us then. I again reiterate that you'll get this so rich, this dialogue, you'll get a tape minus the 10 minutes of introduction to the heart of the dialogue, to go over the comments. And I certainly want to, along with other members of the Kaplan board that were here, there are 4 of them, Caitlin Hayes, Eric Kaplan, Jane is left to go to dinner, to thank Rabbis Elliot Dorff and Rabbi Sid Schwarz for their participation, and Sarah Hurwitz for moderating in a very fine way and finding bridge questions, and of course to the folks in the A More Perfect Union, the Partnership for Democracy, for co-sponsoring. And I'm going to invite people then to stick around if you have some more comments that you would like to make. I'm going to make it a little easier for me to see them. And again, I hope Sid and Elliot and Sarah will accept our wholehearted thanks for a very rich and deep dialogue.
My pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So if someone would like to add to the dialogue your own personal perspective, you'll have to unmute and tell us who you are and what you're thinking about now after this very rich hour and a half with some very deep thinkers about these issues. So.
Could I mention something?
Sure. Tell us who you are.
I'm Elliot Dorff. Hi.
Okay.
I saw something in the chat that I didn't see before, and I think it's important to say. We were talking about social media before and what its problems are. Of course, social media is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good purpose or bad purpose. And it clearly can be used and has been used for good purpose. I mean, my children and my grandchildren use Facebook all the time to communicate with all kinds of people. And if I didn't have 200 emails a day, I would want to do the same sort of thing, right? And there are, and so in sort of dissing, to use their term, dissing social media, we were probably too, at least I was probably too unnuanced about that. Because like social media, like any other tool, it can be and is used for good purpose. It's just that I'm also aware of a lot of the really problematic pieces that it has created, both in political discourse and in interpersonal discourse. And so there's got to be, like every other tool, there have to be rules of the game that get developed so as to maximize its good and minimize its harm.
So this is Caitlin Hayes responding. Sorry, Caitlin, I just wanted to throw this in.
Go ahead.
So just as a younger person who, obviously has grown up as a digital native, I think that the problem with the nuance that's lacking with the discussion, though, is that there was a lot of talk of identity politics and monopolies, but not really clarifying where those monopolies stem from, why monopolies exist under American capitalism, which I think is a really important note, that it's not necessarily unique to social media, that it permeates a lot of different industries in America, and that we see it repeat in a lot of different ways in terms of print media, in terms of social media, in terms of even sectors like energy, that people's access to information is controlled and restricted, that we are only able to access certain ideological viewpoints, and that obviously resentment breeds because of this, right? This is why there are so many people, for example, today that talk about their opposition to quote unquote mainstream news and may turn to, for example, fringe media sources like InfoWars, for example. I think another thing that's important to consider is that when we talk about identity politics, I don't necessarily think identity politics or cancel culture are the enemy here. And I think that it's not necessarily a safe comparison to draw to say that cancel culture is similar to the Cultural Revolution, when in fact, it is a pretty normal thing in America. And I think it is a sign of a healthy and functioning democracy to be able to withdraw public services from an individual like Kanye West when they are engaging in anti-Semitism. A public platform has a right to refuse somebody business services if they're going to be saying things that are hateful. That's hate speech laws. Cancel culture is a term that people will often use, and they'll often use it to draw ire and critique of these practices. But what these practices really mean is that if a platform doesn't like the hateful things that somebody is saying, they can terminate their account. And so they may have to go to a different service to be able to say those things. And that service may be smaller. It may not have the same reach. It may not have the same features. And that is, of course, what's happening, for example, with the figure I just mentioned, Kanye West. He's having to go into smaller and smaller and more extreme platforms that reach fewer and fewer people because Twitter has disabled his account. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's a sign that things are healthily functioning, that we're not allowing neo-Nazis to speak on our platforms. Similarly, when people say transphobic remarks, we probably shouldn't let them be able to spread that vitriol and cause Americans to want to attack or harm or restrict the rights of transgender individuals.
Thanks, Caitlin. For comment, I see that Miriam and Carol both have their hands raised, so let's turn first to Miriam.
Thank you. First, I'd like to agree with Caitlin that I think that we throw around the term cancel culture a little bit the way people used to throw around political correctness and say, oh, you're just being politically correct. But sometimes being politically correct is a very important thing to be. Not using the N word, is very politically correct. And I think we should be very careful not to, so it's not clear that it's always a bad thing to engage in canceling things, but that's not what I wanted to talk about. I appreciated very much both rabbis addressing the issue of bringing our basic values that come out of Judaism in the public square. In other words, whatever values we take from Judaism, we can express and try to get public policy based upon them. Now, I'm as pro-choice as the next guy, as you can imagine. But I'm very concerned. I don't think the argument about establishment, I think it misses the point. Why should people's values about when they think human life begins, whether it's based on theology or whatever, incorrect biology or whatever it's based on, why should those values not be part of the public debate as much as anything else? I mean, why is it more establishment to enact prohibitions on segregation, which that was my life's work, prohibition of segregation, than prohibition of abortion? We happen to disagree. And the things we disagree on come from our respective cultural and religious backgrounds. I don't see why it's more establishment if their view gets enacted than if our view gets enacted. I think it's more restrictive and therefore less American in some ways. And I don't think they're gonna win, but I don't see why that's establishment more than establishing our values, which is, for example, equality and equity. Just saying.
Well, thanks for just saying. That's very profound. I think we'll be thinking about that for a while, but we're going to layer in Carol's comment right now.
Hi, thank you. This has been a very stimulating discussion, going to a lot of different places. I put my question in the chat, actually, when it comes, and it comes out of being in various places and various times. I think we're living in more than two civilizations, actually, these days. It'd be interesting to hear what we say about that. It's America, it's the world, it's being Jewish, where, when, and how we are. It's the isms that we engage in as well. So my question, which I put in the chat, is how easy or difficult is it for us to speak as a Jew on issues when we're in social gatherings with other people? You know, when someone is a person of color, they're speaking without having to say they're a person of color. It's not always, how much is the issue of underneath things, anti-Semitism, still probably there in terms of speaking with the consciousness of Jewish values on issues? I put that question to our speakers or whoever else would like to answer.
We're don't think we're going to have a full dialogue around that. If Sid or Elliot or Sarah have a quick response to it, we'll encounter that, and then I'll go to Joan for a closing comment, and then we will bring the webinar in the afternoon to a close.
Yeah, let me say a word, if I can, to Carol's question. I do a fair amount of mentoring and coaching of rabbis around the country. And beginning with the Trump presidency, rabbis were really feeling between a rock and a hard place to speak to the issues of the day, because even if they only had a small minority of people in their congregation who had voted for Donald Trump, if they tried to weigh in on an issue, contemporary issue, with a Jewish values perspective, which in my view is totally appropriate for a rabbi to do. That's what rabbis are hired to do. They were having their more conservative voices essentially say to the rabbi, you're politicizing the pulpit, it's inappropriate, and they were very aggressive around it. And many rabbis essentially started to pull back from commenting on these issues for that very reason. Now, here's the irony. This does get to issues of, you know, I always get worried about phrases like cancel culture, but let me just tell you the situation, you can put your own label on it. We are in an environment, and have been for some time now, where simply by virtue of the fact that the speaker and or author is Jewish, that it opens up the door for a wholesale attack on everything that not only Judaism represents, but that Israel represents. I spoke some years ago at the World Parliament of Religions on 3 topics that had nothing to do with Israel. And there were people from all over the world of every religion imaginable. And after every presentation, I got a full-on assault about Israel's policy towards Arabs and Palestinians, okay? Now, I was prepared to respond to it, but I'm asking the question, like, where's that coming from, right? And by the way, there are already periodicals that have shut down their letters to the editor pages because they got so uncivil in a sense. And I actually stopped writing for certain platforms that didn't do that because I had a hard time just shutting it out because the responses to an article were so unrelated to the topic at hand. They simply were kind of going for the jugular about anything that Jews represented, which to their mind was akin to world conspiracy, oppression of Palestinians, being part of the kind of military industrial complex, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So do Jews have a right to speak out with a Jewish values perspective? Yes. Is it treacherous and dangerous? For sure. We're in a very different environment where civil discourse has been thrown out the window.
I just want to quickly add to that, and that I agree with Sid. I think it's actually very important for us to speak out from a Jewish values perspective. However, it worries me a little bit that I think a significant majority of American Jews, when they say, well, the Jewish values perspective, it's social justice is my Judaism. Social justice is a Jewish value, and hence I speak out. That's lovely. Social justice is actually a core value in many religious traditions and of any decent secular person. I think that without actually knowing anything about what Judaism specifically says about social justice, about the actual specificity of Jewish law, we actually have a really vast body of wisdom about how you engage in social justice, economic justice, how you treat people. And it worries me a little bit that very few Jews actually know anything about that. So when we're talking about Jews contributing to this public discourse, I really wish that we could find a way to increase Jewish literacy such that they are actually contributing from a specifically Jewish frame of mind.
Thank you, Sarah. Joan, if you would like to pose a quick comment, we'll give you the Acharon Chaviv. You'll have the last comment here.
Okay, and actually, I think what I'm going to echo pretty much is what Sarah and Sid just said, and I'm going to be specifically by returning to the words cancel culture, PC. I think they're a way of shutting down dialogue. That's what they do, and rather than engage in discussion, that's what happens, and things become very uncivil. So really, I think Sid and Sarah did an excellent job of saying what I really wanted to say. So I'm going to end that there.
Okay. We're going to bring the webinar to a close, again, with deep appreciation. Sarah and Elliot and Sid, if you're able to stay on for just 1 minute, I want to do a little bit of closure with you. And otherwise, I want to thank the many people who are with us for such a good long stretch for your contributions to the dialogue. So thank you. Oh, and I have to do since we all believe in continuous learning, if you go to the Kaplan Center website, you will see under Kaplanian Voices a dialogue with Rabbi Dr. Henry Morris that he and I had about a comment Kaplan made in the 30s about mass communication, how amazing it is that the fascists have learned how to master it. But you know what? There's extraordinary potential in that form. So he, for one, would have us focus on what we can yet do and the positive uses there. You can find on the homepage of the Kaplan Center website, which we always encourage you to visit. So my thanks to Eric Kaplan as well for his facilitation of some introductions. Hope you will be with us December 11th. We indeed will be going deeper into this notion and entertaining the possibility that where Kaplan wasn't on target is that we live in 3 or 4 civilizations, a world civilization, a world Jewish, a digital global civilization. What does that mean to our construct? It doesn't blow it up, but it expands it enormously. So if you have a moment, Elliot, Sarah, and Sid, please stay on, and the rest of you, we will say, so Rayam Tovim, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and Erev Tov.
Thank you all.
Thank you.